They call them humanity's protectors. Angels in ceramite, the Emperor's finest. But I've seen what happens when a space marine arrives to save you. I've counted the bodies. I've walked through the streets they leave behind. And I've learned something the Imperium doesn't want you to know. The real terror isn't that they might lose control. It's that they never do. I have been a servant of the Administratum for 37 years. And in that time, I have learned that every number tells a story, if you know how to read it. My name is Frix Vaughn, and I am what the Munitorum calls a lost documentation specialist. A polite way of saying I count the dead after someone else has done the killing. I reconcile discrepancies between projected casualties and actual losses. Trace ammunition expenditure against confirmed eliminations. Ensure every corpse finds its way into the right column of the right ledger, so the Imperium's vast machinery of war can grind forward without pause. It is thankless work, performed in windowless offices lit by flickering lumens, surrounded by data slates that smell of ozone and old fear. I have documented massacres that span continents, calculated the cost of orbital bombardments in lives per second, reduced entire civilizations to footnotes in reports that no one will ever read. I do not do this because I am cruel. I do this because someone must. Because the Imperium demands accounting. And because the alternative to order is the kind of chaos that swallows worlds whole. When I received the assignment for Tertia Majoris, I expected nothing unusual. The briefing slate arrived with the morning rations, a thin wafer of compressed grain, and a cup of recaf so bitter it made my teeth ache. The slate was standard issue. Matte black plastel, the double-headed Aquila embossed on the back. When I activated it, text scrolled in the familiar green phosphor glow of official communication. Tertia Majoris, a tertiary industrial hub in the Van sector. Population: 14 million souls across 3 primary hive complexes and 16 satellite settlements. Recent compliance action conducted by elements of the Astartes, specifically the Storm Wardens chapter, in response to seditious elements within the Planetary Governor's administration. Civilian collateral estimated at 0.03% of total population. Well within acceptable parameters for an Astartes deployment. My task was routine verification, cross-referencing reported casualties with munitions expenditure and witness testimonies, ensuring the numbers aligned with imperial doctrine and strategic necessity. I had documented Astartes actions before, though not frequently. Space Marines operated on a scale and with an efficiency that made my work almost trivial. Their engagements were surgical. Target acquisition flawless. Collateral damage minimal by the standards of the Imperium's cruder instruments. When they descended upon a world, it was because lesser forces had failed, or because the threat required such overwhelming response that only the Emperor's finest could suffice. They were legends made flesh. Warriors whose very presence could turn the tide of wars that had ground on for decades. I had seen the pick captures, the propaganda reels that played in Hablock common rooms, showing an Astartes advancing through storms of fire with a kind of unhurried certainty that made grown men weep with gratitude. I believed in them the way I believed in the throne itself, as a fundamental axiom of imperial existence. The journey to Tertia Majoris took 19 days aboard a bulk freighter that smelled of unwashed bodies and recycled air. I spent most of the transit reviewing preliminary documentation, building the framework I would need to complete the audit once planetside. The initial reports were exemplary, almost textbook in their adherence to protocol. The seditious elements had been identified by inquisitorial sources, their networks mapped with precision, leadership marked for termination. The Storm Wardens deployed a single squad, 10 warriors led by a sergeant whose name was redacted in the files I'd been given. The operation commenced at local midnight, lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes, concluded with total elimination of the targeted cells. Civilian casualties, minimal. Infrastructure damage, negligible. Secondary objectives achieved ahead of schedule. It was the kind of action that would be used in training simulations for decades to come. a model of how the Astartes conducted warfare. But when I arrived on Tertia Majoris and began walking the streets where it had happened, I found the first discrepancy. The primary hive, designated Tertium Prime, rose from the planet's rust-colored surface like a monument to human endurance. A towering spire of rockcrete and steel that housed 7 million souls in layered warrens stretching kilometers into the earth. The seditious elements had operated from the mid-levels, specifically Hab Blocks 94 through 108, a vertical slice of city that should have been swarming with merchants, laborers, shrine tenders, and the countless other human cogs that kept a hive functioning. I had expected to find damage, perhaps a few buildings marked with the scorch patterns of bolter fire, or the telltale cracks of structural reinforcement failing under stress. What I found instead were entire sections that no longer existed. Hab Block 97 was gone. Not damaged. Not burned. Gone. Where it should have stood, there was only empty air and a gap in the cityscape that made my stomach clench with wrongness. The buildings on either side remained intact. Their walls showed no signs of explosion or fire, no cracks radiating from a point of impact. It was as if someone had reached down with godlike precision and simply removed that specific structure from existence, lifting it away without disturbing anything around it. The streets that had led to its entrances now terminated in sheer drops, ending at barriers marked with administrative hazard sigils and guarded by local enforcers who would not meet my eyes when I approached. I asked what had happened to the building. The enforcer, a woman with skin the color of old leather and a lost rifle held across her chest like a talisman, told me she did not know. She had been assigned to this cordon 3 weeks prior, told only that the area was under investigation and no one was to pass. She did not know what had happened to the people who lived there. She did not know where the building had gone. She did not know anything, and the way she said it made me understand. Ignorance had been mandated as thoroughly as any other form of compliance. I consulted my data slate, cross-referencing preliminary reports with architectural schematics pulled from the planetary archives. Hab Block 97 had housed approximately 4,000 residents, mostly mid-tier laborers assigned to manufactorums, producing Lost Rifle power cells and flak armor components. According to the after-action report filed by the Storm Wardens, the building had sustained minimal damage during the compliance action. Fewer than 30 confirmed casualties, resulting from collateral fire during the extraction of one seditious cell leader who had barricaded himself on the 73rd floor. The report noted that the operation had been conducted with exemplary precision, that civilian evacuations had been coordinated in advance, that every discharge of weapons had been calculated to minimize unintended loss of life. But the building was gone, and 4,000 people with it. I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. Over the next 7 days, I walked every street, every level, every access corridor where the Storm Wardens had operated. I interviewed survivors, reviewed medical records from the local Medici facilities, examined ammunition expenditure logs from the chapter's own quartermasters. The more I looked, the more the numbers refused to align. The official casualty count listed 412 dead, a figure that included both seditious elements and civilians caught in crossfire. But when I tallied the missing, when I accounted for the people whose ration chits had gone unclaimed, whose work assignments had been redistributed, whose names appeared on family registry documents, but nowhere else in the planetary databases, the number grew to something closer to 12,000. Entire families had vanished. Whole floors of residential blocks showed no signs of habitation, their doors sealed with wax stamps bearing inquisitorial sigils, their interiors emptied of everything from furniture to the scratches on the walls where children had once marked their heights. I found a school that should have held 300 students, but now stood empty, its desks arranged in perfect rows, as if waiting for a class that would never arrive. I found a shrine to the god Emperor, where the candles still burned, but the congregation had disappeared, leaving only a single servitor that continued to sweep the floors in mindless repetition, its augmetic limbs grinding softly in the silence. No one would speak to me about what had happened. When I pressed for interviews with witnesses, I was told all testimony had been classified by order of the Inquisition. When I requested access to Medicae records, I found entire sections had been redacted, leaving only summaries so vague as to be useless. When I tried to access Vox logs from the night of the operation, I was informed the recordings had been corrupted by atmospheric interference, though the technical specifications of the equipment made that explanation laughable. Someone was erasing the evidence, pruning away anything that contradicted the official narrative. And they were doing it with a kind of thoroughness that suggested resources far beyond simple bureaucratic oversight. I returned to my assigned quarters, a cramped cell in the administratum that smelled of mildew and old fear, and spent the night reviewing everything I had gathered. The data slates formed a mosaic of absence, a pattern of gaps and silences that told a story all their own. I am trained to see such patterns, to recognize when numbers have been massaged or altered, when reality has been bent to fit someone's preferred version of events. What I could not understand was why. The Astartes had won. The seditious elements had been eliminated. The planet remained compliant. There was no strategic reason to hide the true cost, no tactical advantage in obscuring what had actually occurred, unless the cost itself was the thing that needed hiding. I decided to pursue the Vox logs. The administratum maintains redundant archives for all communication traffic, a legacy of distrust stretching back to the Horus Heresy, when traitors had used corrupted data to sow confusion among loyal forces. Even if the primary logs had been purged, copies would exist in tertiary storage systems, often forgotten and poorly maintained, but accessible to someone with the right clearances and enough patience. I spent 2 days navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of Tertium Prime's communications infrastructure, filing requests in triplicate, invoking obscure regulations that granted auditors access to supposedly sealed materials, calling in favors from peers who owed me from previous assignments. Eventually, I found what I was looking for in a sub-hive so deep that the air tasted of rust, and the lumens flickered with the unreliability of ancient power conduits. The Vox logs had not been corrupted. They had been edited. I could see the cuts, the places where segments had been excised with surgical precision, leaving gaps in the timeline like missing teeth in a skull. But whoever had performed the editing had been sloppy in one crucial respect. They had left the timestamps intact. And by comparing the duration of the original recordings with what remained, I could calculate exactly how much had been removed. 4 hours and 17 minutes of operation, but only 41 minutes of recorded Vox traffic. Someone had deleted 3.5 hours of audio, and they had done it in a way that suggested they wanted to preserve certain segments while erasing others. I played what remained. The first voice I heard was calm, almost casual, speaking in the clipped Gothic of Astartes battle cant. Asterisk contact established. Entering Hablock 94. Resistance minimal. Advancing to primary objective. Asterisk. There was no fear in that voice. No hesitation. Only the flat certainty of someone describing actions already completed. In the background, I could hear other sounds. Distant pops that might have been gunfire or doors being breached. A low rumble that could have been an explosion or simply the ambient noise of a hive at night. The voice continued, narrating the squad's progress through the building with the same unhurried precision. Marking floors cleared, rooms searched, targets eliminated. Then a gap. 17 minutes of silence where something had been removed. When the recording resumed, the voice had changed. Not in tone, but in what it was saying. Civilian concentration point Alpha secure. Estimate 400 units. Requesting guidance on disposition. Units. Not people. Units. As if the 400 men, women, and children corralled in whatever space Alpha designated were components to be cataloged rather than souls to be saved. There was a pause, presumably while the Astartes waited for a response, and then the voice spoke again. Acknowledged. Proceeding with Protocol Tertia. Estimated completion in 30 minutes. Another gap. This one lasting 43 minutes. When the log picked up again, all I could hear was screaming. It lasted for 11 seconds before cutting to silence. And in those 11 seconds, I heard more raw terror than in all my years documenting battlefields. It was not the sound of people caught in crossfire, not the panic shouts of civilians fleeing an active combat zone. It was something older, something primal. The noise that prey makes when it understands there is no escape, and death is coming not as a possibility, but as an absolute certainty. And beneath the screaming, almost inaudible, I could hear something else. A rhythmic sound, wet and heavy, like meat being tenderized, or bones breaking under sustained pressure. The log ended. I sat in that archive for a long time after the recording stopped, staring at the data slate in my hands and trying to reconcile what I had just heard with everything I believed about the Astartes. They were humanity's defenders, the Emperor's chosen warriors who stood between mankind and the horrors of a galaxy that wanted nothing more than to devour us all. They were not butchers. They were not executioners of the innocent. They were supposed to be better than that, elevated above the cruelties that lesser men might resort to in the name of necessity. But the Vox log did not lie. I began searching for pick feeds next, reasoning that if Vox traffic had been preserved, even in edited form, visual records might exist as well. Tertium Prime's security infrastructure was extensive. Thousands of picked capture units mounted on every major thoroughfare and intersection, feeding data to central monitoring stations where menial servitors watched for signs of unrest or criminal activity. The feeds were stored for 90 days before being purged to make room for new recordings, which meant the night of the Astartes action should still be retrievable. I filed the appropriate requests, cited my authority as a Munitorum auditor, and waited for access to be granted. It was denied. The denial came from an office I had never heard of, buried so deep in the administratum charts it was impossible to even confirm it existed. The Ordo of Selective Archival Maintenance, a subdivision of the Inquisition's administrative apparatus, responsible for determining which records were preserved for posterity and which were deemed unnecessary for imperial continuity. The message was polite but absolute. All picked capture records from the relevant dates had been transferred to inquisitorial custody for ongoing investigation. No exceptions would be made. My clearance, while sufficient for standard auditing procedures, did not extend to materials involved in active inquisitorial inquiries. Any further attempts to access restricted data would be noted in my permanent record and might result in disciplinary action up to and including termination of service. I understood the message clearly. Stop looking. But I had spent 37 years learning how to read between the lines of imperial bureaucracy, and I knew that absolute prohibitions often pointed toward the things most worth finding. If the Inquisition had taken the pick feeds, it meant there was something in them significant enough to warrant such heavy-handed control. It also meant that somewhere in the vast tangle of Tertium Prime's data infrastructure, there would be fragments they had missed. Backups created by redundant systems, or archived by diligent servitors, following protocols no one remembered to update. I found them 3 days later in the most unlikely of places. The local ecclesiarchy maintained its own network of picked capture units, ostensibly for monitoring pilgrim traffic and ensuring proper observance of holy days. The feeds were stored locally in the Cathedral of the Eternal Vigil, a Baroque structure of stained glass and gold leaf that rose from the lower hive like a promise of salvation. The priests who maintained the archives were old, half-blind from decades spent reading scripture by candlelight, and deeply uninterested in the activities of administrative auditors. When I explained I needed to verify certain details for a routine compliance report, they waved me toward the archive chambers with the kind of indifference that comes from believing nothing in the material world truly matters. The picked feeds were stored on ancient data cylinders, the kind that required manual playback on machines that wheezed and clicked like dying animals. I loaded the cylinder corresponding to the night of the operation and began advancing through the footage, watching the empty streets of Tertium Prime in grainy black and white. For the first hour, nothing happened. The camera showed a plaza adjacent to Hab Block 96. its surface marked with the usual detritus of hive life, discarded ration tins and scraps of parchment blowing in the recycled wind. A few pedestrians crossed the frame, hunched figures moving with the weariness of people returning from long shifts in the manufactorum. Then the Astartes arrived. Even through the degraded quality of the footage, they were unmistakable. 10 figures in power armor, so massive they made the street seem small. Their ceramite plating painted in the dark blue and silver of the Storm Wardens. Their weapons held with the casual readiness of apex predators. They moved in formation, advancing toward Hab Block 96 with a precision that suggested extensive planning. Each warrior knowing exactly where to position himself to achieve maximum tactical coverage. At the front walked a sergeant, his armor marked with additional honors and purity seals, his helm adorned with a crest that caught the dim light of the street lumens. They did not hurry. That was what struck me first. There was no urgency in their movements. No sense they were responding to an active threat or racing against time. They walked the way gods might walk, certain of their dominance, utterly unconcerned with the possibility of resistance. When they reached the entrance to the Hab Block, the sergeant raised one armored fist, and the entire squad halted with synchronous perfection. He turned to face his warriors, and though I could not hear what he said, I could see the way they reacted, each Astartes shifting slightly, adjusting weapons or checking ammunition with the smooth efficiency of a ritual performed 1,000 times before. Then they entered the building. For 17 minutes, the picked feed showed nothing but the empty street. I watched the timestamp advance, counting seconds, trying to imagine what was happening inside that building beyond the camera's view. The Vox log had placed the initial breach at this time. The Storm Wardens advancing floor by floor, clearing rooms and neutralizing targets with bolter and blade. It should have been loud, explosive, the kind of urban combat that leaves scars on a city's face. But the street remained quiet, undisturbed, as if nothing at all were occurring just meters away. Then the screaming started. It was faint at first, muffled by the building's walls and the poor audio quality of a recording, but unmistakable in its character. The picked feed could not show me what was happening inside, but the audio picked up enough to paint a picture I did not want to see. Hundreds of voices, maybe more, rising in a chorus of terror that seemed to go on forever. And punctuating the screams were other sounds. The distinctive bark of bolter fire, the crash of something heavy impacting flesh and bone, the wet crunch of bodies being destroyed with methodical thoroughness. I forced myself to keep watching. 43 minutes later, the Astartes emerged. They walked with the same unhurried certainty they had shown entering, their armor now marked with streaks and spatters of red that looked black in the grainy footage. The sergeant paused at the threshold, turning back to survey the building one final time, and I found myself wondering what he saw that made him nod with what looked like satisfaction. Then he raised his hand again, and the squad reformed, moving back across the plaza with the same mechanical precision, leaving the Hab Block behind as if it were nothing more than another objective ticked off a list. The building was silent now. I advanced the footage, watching the empty street for another hour, hoping to see survivors emerge, hoping to see enforcers arriving to secure the scene, hoping to see anything that would suggest the screaming had been exaggerated or misunderstood. But no one came. The building simply stood there, dark and still. And as dawn began to lighten the sky in the recording, I could see something that made my hand start to shake. The windows were covered in red, not painted, not marked with graffiti, covered, as if someone had thrown buckets of blood against the glass from the inside, coating every surface in a layer of crimson that reflected the rising sun like rubies. I zoomed the image as far as the ancient equipment would allow, trying to make out details. And what I saw made me understand why the Inquisition had seized every other recording. The blood was not splattered. It was sprayed, distributed with such even coverage that it could only have been done deliberately, methodically, as if someone had taken the time to ensure every window bore the same message. And in that pattern, in that terrible uniformity, I saw the truth I had been circling without wanting to name it. This had not been a battle. It had been a demonstration. I spent the next week trying to find someone who would talk to me about what had actually happened that night. Someone who had seen it firsthand and survived to tell the tale. The survivors I had interviewed previously had all given the same vague statements, carefully worded testimonies that praised the Astartes for their swift and decisive action, while offering nothing concrete about what that action had entailed. But I had been conducting audits long enough to recognize coach statements. And I knew that for every person willing to recite the official line, there were others who had refused to speak at all. I found one in the lower levels of Tertium Prime, in a district so deep that the hive's recycled air tasted of metal and desperation. Her name was Cetra, and she had been a shift supervisor in one of the manufactorums before the compliance action. Now she worked sorting scrap metal in a processing facility that paid in meal vouchers rather than throne gelt. And when I approached her, she looked at me with the hollow eyes of someone who had seen something they could never unsee. She did not want to talk. I told her I was not there to threaten her, that I only wanted to understand what had happened, that the Imperium deserved a true accounting of events rather than the sanitized version being promoted by official channels. She laughed at that, a sound like glass breaking, and told me the Imperium did not care about truth, only compliance. But she talked anyway, perhaps because keeping silent had become its own kind of torture, perhaps because she needed someone else to carry the weight of what she knew. She had been in Hab Block 98 the night the Storm Wardens came. Cetra told me the first sign of the Astartes was not sound or sight, but smell. She had been preparing for sleep, washing in the communal facilities on her floor, when she noticed a change in the air. It was subtle at first, a sharpness that reminded her of ozone and burnt metal, the kind of scent that accompanied heavy machinery or electrical discharge. But as it grew stronger, she recognized it for what it was. The distinctive odor of ceramite and promethium, the smell of the Astartes themselves, so potent it preceded them like a herald. The building's Vox system crackled to life, and a voice she did not recognize ordered all residents to proceed immediately to the central atrium on the ground floor. There was no explanation, no context, just a command delivered with the flat authority of someone who expected instant obedience. Cetra had hesitated, confused and frightened by the strangeness of the order. But when she heard the sound of armored boots in the corridor outside her quarters, she understood that hesitation was not an option. She joined the stream of residents moving toward the stairs. Hundreds of people flowing downward through the building's arterial passages. Parents carrying children. Elderly citizens clutching walking sticks. Workers still wearing the grime of their shifts. No one spoke. The silence was absolute, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the occasional cough or whimper from a frightened child. It was as if everyone understood instinctively that whatever was happening required submission. That resistance would be not merely futile, but fatal. When she reached the atrium, she found it packed with people. So many bodies pressed together that breathing became difficult, and the temperature climbed despite the building's environmental systems. The Astartes stood at the perimeter. 10 giants in blue and silver armor, their weapons held ready, but not aimed at any specific target. They did not speak. They simply watched, their helmed faces inscrutable, their presence radiating a kind of menace that made Cetra's hindbrain scream at her to run, even as her conscious mind understood that running was impossible. Then the sergeant stepped forward. He removed his helmet, and Cetra described his face as the most beautiful and terrible thing she had ever seen. He was young, far younger than she had expected, with features that seemed carved from marble and eyes that held depths of experience no human could match. When he spoke, his voice was clear and resonant, filling the atrium without effort. And what he said made Cetra understand that she and everyone around her were already dead. He told them they were being given a choice. The building, he explained, had been harboring seditious elements, individuals who had turned from the Emperor's light and embraced the cancerous philosophies of traitors and heretics. These individuals had been identified and eliminated. their corruption purged with cleansing fire and righteous wrath. But their heresy had metastasized, spreading through the building's population like a disease, infecting the faithful with doubt and fear. The Imperium could not allow such infection to spread unchecked, could not permit even the possibility that sedition might take root in hearts that should know only loyalty. So they were being offered a chance to prove their faith. Anyone who had harbored doubts, anyone who had listened to the whispers of the heretics, anyone who felt even the faintest tremor of uncertainty about the Emperor's divine mandate, was invited to step forward and confess. Such confessions would be viewed favorably, treated as evidence of repentance rather than guilt. Those who confessed would be separated from the faithful and given the opportunity to redeem themselves through service to the Imperium. Their lives preserved in exchange for absolute obedience to the will of the throne. Those who remained silent would be assumed innocent and permitted to return to their quarters once the investigation was complete. Cetra told me she knew immediately it was a lie. There was something in the sergeant's eyes, a cold certainty that made it clear he was not offering mercy, but merely sorting the population into categories for easier processing. She watched as people began stepping forward, some weeping openly, others maintaining stoic silence, all of them believing, or perhaps just hoping, that confession would save them. The Astartes directed the confessors to one side of the atrium, herding them with gestures of their weapons, forming them into a tightly packed group that grew larger with each passing minute. When no more confessions came, the sergeant nodded and replaced his helmet. What happened next occurred so quickly that Cetra's mind could barely process it. The Astartes opened fire, not at the confessors, but at the crowd of those who had remained silent. Those who had believed their innocence would protect them. Bolter rounds tore through bodies with horrifying efficiency, each explosive shell detonating inside flesh, turning human beings into clouds of red mist and shattered bone. The screaming began, but it was drowned out almost immediately by the relentless thunder of sustained bolter fire, a sound so loud and so pervasive that Cetra felt it in her chest like a second heartbeat. She ran. Everyone ran, or tried to, but there was nowhere to go. The Astartes had positioned themselves to create a kill zone with no exits, a geometric trap that ensured maximum efficiency in the slaughter. Cetra threw herself behind a decorative pillar, pressing her body against the rockcrete and praying to the Emperor for deliverance, while all around her people died in numbers that defied comprehension. She could hear them, the wet sounds of bodies hitting the floor, the crack of bones snapping under the weight of collapsing corpses, the gurgling cries of those who had not died immediately and were drowning in their own blood. It lasted for 11 seconds. When the firing stopped, Cetra remained frozen behind her pillar, too terrified to move or even breathe. She heard the Astartes moving through the atrium, the heavy tread of their boots splashing in the lakes of blood that now covered the floor. She heard something else, too, a rhythmic sound that she eventually recognized as the Astartes methodically finishing off survivors with their combat blades, moving from body to body with surgical precision to ensure no one remained alive. Then the sergeant spoke again, addressing the confessors who had been spared the initial slaughter. He thanked them for their honesty, told them their confessions had been noted and would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities for evaluation. In the meantime, they were to remain in the atrium under the supervision of the Astartes until transport could be arranged to take them to a penitent facility where they would begin their service to the Imperium. The confessors, numb with shock and surrounded by the bodies of their neighbors, simply nodded and did as they were told. Cetra watched from behind her pillar as the Astartes began arranging the bodies, stacking them in neat rows that suggested experience with this kind of work. They moved without conversation, each warrior knowing exactly what was expected of him, creating order from carnage with the same efficiency they had shown in creating the carnage itself. When they finished, the atrium looked less like a massacre site and more like a morgue. The bodies laid out with almost respectful precision, ready for processing and disposal. The sergeant walked among the confessors, examining them one by one. and Cetra saw him pause occasionally to mark certain individuals with a device she could not clearly see. When he finished, he gestured to his warriors, and they began separating the marked confessors from the unmarked, dividing them into two groups with ruthless efficiency. The unmarked group, perhaps 100 people, were directed toward the building's main exit and told to disperse to their quarters. The marked group, numbering approximately 300, were told to remain where they were. The unmarked confessors fled, running from the atrium with the desperate speed of people who could not believe their good fortune, who understood on some instinctive level that staying would mean death, but could not articulate why. Cetra watched them go, and felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, the Astartes were done, that the killing had reached its end, and the survivors would be permitted to live. Then the sergeant raised his hand, and the Astartes opened fire on the marked confessors. It was faster this time, more clinical, the bolter rounds finding their targets with practiced ease and ending lives in fractions of seconds. The confessors barely had time to register what was happening before they ceased to exist, as anything more than components of the growing pile of dead. When it was over, the atrium held only corpses and Astartes, and Cetra, pressed tighter against her pillar, prayed they would not notice the one survivor hiding in the shadows. She did not know how long she stayed there, cramped and frozen, and smelling the copper tang of blood, so thick it made her gag. Eventually, she heard the Astartes leaving, their boots receding into the distance. And only then did she dare to move. She crawled from her hiding place, slipping in blood that had grown tacky and cold, and made her way to the stairs leading to the upper levels. She did not look at the bodies. She could not. It took her 6 hours to find a way out of the building that did not involve passing through areas controlled by the Astartes. She emerged into the dawn light and immediately vomited, emptying her stomach until there was nothing left but dry heaves and the taste of bile. She walked to the nearest enforcer station and tried to report what she had seen. But the enforcers looked at her with eyes that held no surprise, only resignation, and told her that all testimony regarding the compliance action had to be filed with the administratum, which would forward it to the appropriate authorities. She never filed a report. When I asked her why not, she told me she understood by then what the compliance action had actually been. It was not an attempt to eliminate seditious elements. It was a test, a brutal calculus designed to measure loyalty, not through faith, but through fear. The Astartes had given people a choice between confession and silence. And then they had killed everyone regardless of what they chose, proving that in the eyes of the Imperium, there was no difference between the guilty and the innocent, only the obedient and the dead. And the confessors who had been released, the unmarked ones who had fled the atrium believing they had been spared, carried with them the knowledge of what happened to those who hesitated when the Astartes gave commands. They would spread that knowledge through the hive like a virus, infecting everyone they encountered with the understanding that when the Emperor's chosen arrived, the only correct response was immediate and absolute compliance. Resistance was death. Doubt was death. Even confession was death, unless the Astartes decided otherwise. Fear had been weaponized with surgical precision. Cetra finished her story and looked at me with eyes that held no hope, only exhausted understanding. She told me the Astartes had not lost control or made mistakes. Every death in that atrium had been calculated, measured against some internal formula that determined acceptable loss versus optimal fear generation. They had killed exactly the right number of people in exactly the right way to ensure that tertia majores would never again harbor sedition. Not because the population was loyal, but because they were terrified. I asked her how she had survived. She told me she did not know, that perhaps the Astartes had simply missed her, or perhaps they had allowed her to live deliberately, knowing that a single witness would spread the story more effectively than any official propaganda. Either way, she was alive, and she carried the weight of 4,000 deaths in a memory that would never fade and could never be shared without risking the same fate that had befallen the confessors. I thanked her for her testimony and promised I would include it in my audit. She laughed again, that same broken glass sound, and told me I was a fool if I thought the Imperium would permit the truth to be recorded. I returned to my quarters and spent the night trying to reconcile what Cetra had told me with the image of the Astartes I had carried for 37 years. The warriors who defended humanity from Xenos horrors and demonic incursions, who stood as bulwarks against the galaxy's infinite cruelties, who represented the emperors while made manifest in transhuman flesh. I had believed in them the way children believe in saints, as moral absolutes existing beyond the compromises and cruelties of ordinary warfare. But the evidence would not permit such belief. The Vox logs, the picked feeds, Cetra's testimony, the missing populations and sealed buildings and redacted records. All of it pointed toward a truth that was simultaneously obvious and unbearable. The Astartes were not protectors who occasionally made hard choices in defense of humanity. They were enforcement mechanisms, designed and deployed to maintain imperial compliance through the application of overwhelming force and carefully calculated terror. They were not here to save us. They were here to ensure we remained useful. I began compiling my final report, knowing even as I wrote that it would never be accepted. That the moment I submitted documentation contradicting the official narrative, I would be marked for censure, or worse. But I am an auditor, and my duty is to the truth of numbers, to the reality they represent rather than the stories we tell about them. I documented every discrepancy, every missing person, every sealed building and redacted testimony. I included Cetra's account in full, along with transcripts of the edited Vox logs and stills from the pick feeds showing the Astartes emerging from Hab Block 96 with their armor painted in blood. I calculated the true casualty count, 14,732 dead, not 0.03% of the population, slightly more than 1/10%, still within acceptable parameters by the brutal mathematics of imperial warfare, but a far cry from the minimal collateral damage claimed in the official reports. And more importantly, I noted that the deaths had not been accidental or incidental to the primary objective. They had been the objective, a deliberate culling designed to instill lasting terror in a population the Imperium had deemed insufficiently compliant. I included a final section analyzing the strategic logic of such an action, trying to understand the calculus that would make mass murder an acceptable tool of governance. The mathematics were straightforward once I stopped thinking of the dead as people and started thinking of them as variables in an equation balancing fear against productivity. Kill too few, and the population might not take the lesson seriously, might convince themselves the Astartes had simply made mistakes or been focused only on legitimate targets. Kill too many, and you risk destroying the labor force required to keep the planet functioning, turning compliance into Pyrrhic victory. But kill exactly the right number in exactly the right way, witnessed by exactly the right survivors, and you created a fear that would outlast generations, a collective trauma that would make the population self-policing, eager to root out sedition before the Astartes returned. It was brilliant in its cruelty. I submitted my report to the Munitorum's Central Processing Office on Tertium Prime, and waited for the response I knew would come. It arrived within 6 hours, delivered not through normal channels, but by a personal courier bearing the seal of the Ordo Hereticus. The message was brief, written in the clipped Gothic of official censure. My report had been reviewed by the appropriate authorities and found to contain factual inaccuracies and unsubstantiated claims that contradicted verified accounts from multiple reliable sources. I was to amend my findings to align with the official casualty figures of 412 dead, acknowledging that while regrettable, such losses were well within acceptable parameters for an operation of this nature. Any attempt to submit alternative figures would be considered an act of sedition, as it would undermine public confidence in the Astartes, and by extension, the Imperium itself. I was reminded that my oath of service bound me to accuracy in service of imperial interests, not to the pursuit of truth for its own sake. The message concluded with a choice. Presented with the same false generosity the Astartes sergeant had shown the confessors in Hablock 98. I could amend my report and continue my service to the administratum, my record unmarred and my future secure. Or I could persist in my current course and accept the consequences, which would include immediate termination of employment, confiscation of all personal assets, and possible referral to the Inquisition for further investigation into my own loyalty. They were offering me the same deal they had offered everyone else. Comply or die. I spent 3 days considering my options, walking the streets of Tertium Prime and watching the way people moved with a new weariness. How they kept their heads down and avoided gathering in large groups. How they flinched at shadows and checked over their shoulders with nervous frequency. The fear was palpable. A living thing that had soaked into the city's foundations and altered its character in ways that would take decades to fade, if they ever did. I thought about Cetra, about the broken glass sound of her laugh and the hollow certainty in her eyes when she told me the Imperium did not care about truth. I thought about the 4,000 people in Hablock 97 who had simply ceased to exist, erased from reality with the same clinical precision the Astartes applied to everything they did. I thought about all the other audits I had conducted over 37 years, all the numbers I had reconciled and reports I had filed, and I wondered how many of them had been sanitized versions of horrors I had never bothered to investigate. I thought about what it meant to serve an Imperium that measured human lives as acceptable losses and deployed its finest warriors not to protect humanity, but to terrify it into submission. In the end, I made my choice. I amended the report. I changed the casualty figures to match the official count, removed all references to Cetra's testimony and the pick feeds and vox logs that contradicted the approved narrative. I wrote that the Storm Wardens had conducted the operation with exemplary precision and minimal collateral damage, that the seditious elements had been eliminated with surgical efficiency, that civilian casualties were regrettable, but well within acceptable parameters given the nature of the threat. I submitted the amended report and received confirmation of its acceptance within the hour. My record remained unblemished. My service continued uninterrupted. I was commended for my diligence and thoroughness, and assigned to my next audit on a world whose name I have already forgotten. But I kept copies of everything. The original vox logs, the pick feeds, Cetra's testimony transcribed word for word, the calculations showing the true casualty count. All of it stored on data wafers, hidden in places where even the Inquisition would be unlikely to find them. I told myself I was preserving the truth for some future reckoning, for a day when the Imperium might value accuracy over narrative control and demand an honest accounting of what had been done in its name. I do not believe that day will ever come, but I needed to believe I had not simply surrendered, that some part of me still clung to the idea that truth mattered, even when no one wanted to hear it. So I hid the evidence and went back to my work, counting the dead for an Imperium that measured corpses in percentages and called slaughter acceptable as long as it served the greater good. I still think about tertium majores sometimes, in the quiet moments between audits when my mind drifts and my defense is lower. I think about the sergeant removing his helmet to reveal that beautiful, terrible face, about the calculated precision with which he sorted people into categories for slaughter, about the way he had turned confession itself into a weapon. I think about the Astartes emerging from Hablock 96 with blood sprayed across their armor in patterns that suggested deliberate effort rather than simple combat spatter. And I think about what it means that I amended the report, that when faced with the same choice given to the confessors in the atrium, I chose compliance over truth because survival seemed more important than integrity. I tell myself I am being strategic, that by remaining in my position, I can continue to document the Imperium's excesses, and perhaps find ways to smuggle the truth to people who might actually be able to do something with it. But I know this is a lie, a comfortable fiction. I tell myself to avoid confronting the reality that I am simply afraid. Afraid of the Inquisition, afraid of losing my position and the small securities it provides. afraid most of all of becoming another number in someone else's casualty report. A data point representing acceptable loss in service of some goal I will never understand. The Astartes are not monsters. That is the thing I have come to understand. The truth that sits like lead in my stomach and makes sleep difficult on the nights when I cannot stop my mind from circling back to tertia majores. Monsters act from impulse or madness, from corrupted desires or broken psychologies that make their actions comprehensible even when horrifying. But the Astartes are not broken. They are functioning exactly as designed, executing protocols written by minds that understand human psychology with the same clarity they understand ballistics and tactics. They are tools, forged and perfected over 10,000 years, designed to achieve specific objectives through the application of specific methods. And one of those methods is terror, deployed with the same precision they bring to every other aspect of warfare. They do not lose control. They do not make mistakes. They do not kill more than necessary or less than required. They calculate the acceptable cost in lives and pay it without hesitation or remorse because they are not capable of doubt. That is what makes them so terrifying. Not their strength or their weapons or their transhuman enhancements, though all of those things contribute to the horror of facing them. What makes them truly terrifying is their absolute certainty, their unshakable conviction that they are right, and that whatever they do in service of that conviction is justified. They do not struggle with moral questions. They do not lie awake wondering if there might have been another way. They simply execute their mission parameters with flawless efficiency and move on to the next world that requires their attention. The Imperium fears them not because they might turn traitor, though that threat exists and has been realized in the darkest chapters of our history. The Imperium fears them because they are correct, because their cold mathematics of acceptable loss and strategic terror actually work, because worlds that receive the kind of compliance action tertia majores experienced do not rebel again for generations, if ever. The fear they generate is so profound, so deeply embedded in the collective psyche of populations who have witnessed their work, that it becomes self-perpetuating, passing from parents to children as stories that become legends and finally myths about the Emperor's angels who punish the unfaithful with exterminating fury. And the truly horrifying thing is that this is necessary. I have audited enough battlefields to know the galaxy is not kind, that humanity clings to existence by its fingernails in a universe filled with things that want to eat us or corrupt us or simply erase us from reality. The Xenos are real. The heretics are real. The demonic forces that claw at the boundaries between the material and immaterial are monstrously, undeniably real. The Imperium's cruelty is not sadism for its own sake, but a calculated response to threats that demand overwhelming force and absolute compliance. The Astartes exist because we need them to exist. Because without their terrible certainty and ruthless efficiency, humanity would have been consumed millennia ago. They are the price we pay for survival, the compromise we make between extinction and freedom. And that price is measured in lives like those lost on tertia majores. People who died not because they were guilty, but because their death served a strategic purpose. I do not know if I can live with that understanding, but I do not have a choice. None of us do. We serve the Imperium because the alternative is annihilation. And if that service requires us to look the other way when the Emperor's chosen commit atrocities in our name, then we look away and tell ourselves it was necessary. We amend our reports and file them in triplicate and move on to the next audit, counting corpses and reconciling ledgers and pretending that numbers on a data slate are not also people who once lived and breathed and loved and feared. I am Rix Vaughn, and I have been a servant of the Administratum for 37 years. I have learned that every number tells a story if you know how to read it. And I have learned that some stories are too dangerous to tell, that truth is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford, and that the greatest terror is not the monsters that threaten us from without, but the ones we create ourselves and call necessary. The Astartes are coming. They are always coming to some world in some sector, answering some call for aid or compliance or simple extermination. They will descend in drop pods trailing fire, or stride from thunderhawks with bolters held ready, or simply appear as if summoned by the weight of humanity's need. They will do what they were designed to do, with perfect efficiency and absolute conviction. They will kill exactly the right number of people in exactly the right way to ensure compliance lasts another generation. And when they leave, people like me will count the dead and file reports that transform atrocity into acceptable loss, that reduce the screaming and the blood and the broken bodies to percentages and statistical variance. We will tell ourselves it was necessary. We will tell ourselves there was no other way. We will tell ourselves that the alternative would have been worse, and maybe we will even be right. But we will remember, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between audits when our minds drift and our defenses lower, we will remember the faces we saw in pick feeds, the voices we heard in Vox logs, the testimonies we erased and the truth we amended in service of a lie we call necessary. We will carry those memories like scars, hidden beneath our robes and behind our eyes. And we will wonder if the price of survival might eventually become too high, even for creatures as desperate as us. I wonder if the Astartes ever think about the people they kill. I wonder if they dream. And if so, whether those dreams are haunted by the faces of confessors who believed confession would save them, or children who died because they lived in the wrong building at the wrong time, or old men and women who survived a lifetime of service to the Imperium only to be categorized as acceptable loss in the final hours of their existence. I wonder if they feel anything at all when they pull the trigger, or if that capacity was burned out of them during the process that transformed them from boys into weapons. If doubt and mercy and compassion are simply incompatible with the function they were designed to fulfill. I wonder if I would recognize myself if I could see what I have become. If the young man who joined the Administratum 37 years ago, believing in truth and service and the fundamental righteousness of the Imperium's cause, would understand the compromises I have made and the lies I have told and the silence I have chosen in place of integrity. I suspect he would not. But that young man is gone, erased as thoroughly as the residents of Hablock 97. And what remains is someone who knows too much and does too little, who files amended reports and keeps hidden copies and tells himself that survival is a virtue rather than a cowardice. The Imperium endures. That is what we tell ourselves. The mantra we repeat when the weight of service becomes too heavy and the cost of compliance too high. The Imperium endures because we endure. Because we accept the necessary cruelties and file the appropriate paperwork and look away when looking too closely would force us to confront truths we cannot change. We are the machinery that keeps the vast engine of human civilization grinding forward, processing bodies and resources and loyalty into the raw materials of survival. And the Astartes are the enforcement mechanisms that ensure the machinery never stops, that ensure compliance remains absolute and fear remains perpetual, and that no one ever forgets what happens when you question whether the price might be too high. They are terrifying not because they are monsters, but because they are perfect, functioning exactly as intended, achieving objectives with mathematical precision, and moving on without hesitation or regret. They are terrifying because they prove that cruelty can be rational, that atrocity can be calculated, that you can transform human suffering into strategic advantage and call it necessary. They are terrifying because they are right. And knowing that, understanding it with the certainty that comes from walking through the aftermath of their work and counting the bodies they leave behind, is the thing I cannot reconcile with the man I used to believe I was. So I file my reports and move to the next assignment, carrying the weight of tertia majoris like a stone in my chest, knowing I will add more stones with each audit, each amendment, each moment of silence chosen over truth. I will continue until the weight becomes unbearable, or until I cease to notice it, until I become so numb to the horror that I can look at 14,000 dead and see only acceptable loss. Perhaps that is the real terror. Not what the Astartes do to the bodies of the faithless, but what the Imperium does to the souls of the faithful. The way it grinds us down and reshapes us until we can participate in our own corruption and call it duty. We become complicit not through malice, but through exhaustion, not through cruelty, but through the simple human need to survive another day in a galaxy that offers no rewards for integrity and no mercy for doubt. I am 53 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life in service to an Imperium I no longer believe in but cannot abandon. I have documented atrocities and called them compliance actions. I have counted the dead and filed them as acceptable losses. I have amended truth to serve expedience and told myself it was necessary. And I will continue to do so until I am no longer useful, at which point I will become another number in someone else's audit. Another data point representing the Imperium's infinite capacity to consume those who serve it. The Astartes are not the horror. We are. We who count the bodies and file the reports and maintain the machinery of oppression that makes their terrible efficiency possible. We who know the truth and choose silence. We who see the cost and pay it anyway, because the alternative seems worse, or because we lack the courage to imagine there might be another way. The galaxy is vast and dark and filled with things that want to destroy us. And perhaps the Imperium's cruelty is the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. Perhaps the Astartes are necessary. Their calculated terror, the price we must pay for survival. Perhaps there is no other way. But I will die knowing what we paid for that survival. And I will die knowing I chose to hide the cost rather than force the Imperium to acknowledge it. That knowledge sits in my chest like broken glass, cutting with every breath. And I suspect it will be the last thing I feel before whatever end awaits me in service to the God Emperor and his Imperium of man. The truth is hidden but not lost. The numbers are amended, but the reality remains. Stored on data wafers in places where perhaps someday someone will find them and understand what was done in the name of compliance. What price was paid, and who paid it, and how little their suffering mattered in the grand calculus of imperial survival. I am Rix Vaughn, Lost Documentation Specialist, servant of the Administratum for 37 years. And I am afraid of the Astartes and what they represent, afraid of the Imperium and what it demands, afraid of myself and what I have become, but most of all, afraid that this fear will fade, that I will grow accustomed to the horror and learn to file my reports without feeling the weight of the lives they represent, that I will become the thing the Imperium needs me to be, a functionary who processes atrocity with the same detachment I apply to ammunition, expenditure, and casualty ratios. Perhaps that has already happened. Perhaps I crossed that threshold on tertia majoris when I chose compliance over truth. And everything since has been nothing more than the final spasms of a conscience that no longer matters. I do not know. I only know that the Astartes are coming, always coming, to worlds that need them or deserve them or simply drew their attention through the vagaries of imperial logistics. They will do what they were designed to do, with terrible precision and absolute conviction. They will leave behind the dead and the traumatized and the compliant. And people like me will count the cost and amend the records and ensure the Imperium's machinery continues to function without pause or reflection. That is the answer to the question I did not know I was asking when I arrived on tertia majoris expecting propaganda and heroism. Just how terrifying is a space marine really? Terrifying enough to make you understand that survival sometimes requires becoming the thing you fear most. Terrifying enough to reveal that the Imperium's greatest horror is not what it does to its enemies, but what it demands of its servants. Terrifying enough to make you complicit in atrocity and call it duty. Terrifying enough to prove that the monsters are not the ones in armor, but the ones who count the bodies they leave behind and file the appropriate paperwork and move on to the next assignment without ever asking if there might have been another way. That is how terrifying a space marine really is. Not because of what they are, but because of what they make us become.